In the darkness of a ship's hold, in the suffocating heat and stench of human misery, 53 Africans lay chained. They had been stolen from their homes, torn from their families, packed like cargo into the belly of a slave ship. They were being transported to a life of bondage in a land they had never seen, to work until they died in fields they would never own. But on the night of July 1, 1839, in the waters off the coast of Cuba, something extraordinary happened. Something that would shake the foundations of international law, challenge the conscience of a nation, and force America to confront the brutal reality of its own complicity in the slave trade. The Africans rose up. They broke their chains. They fought back. This is not just a story about a slave revolt. This is a story about the fundamental question of human freedom, about whether human beings can be property, about whether the law protects all people or only some, about whether justice is truly blind or whether it sees only power and profit. This is the story of La Amistad, the Spanish word for friendship, ironically the name of a ship that carried no friendship, only suffering. This is the story of the Africans who refused to accept slavery, the lawyers who fought for their freedom, and the trial that asked America to live up to its highest ideals. This is the story of Cinque, whose Mende name was Sengbe Pai, a rice farmer who became a revolutionary, a captive who became a symbol of resistance, a man who stood before the Supreme Court of the United States and demanded his right to be free. Before we begin this remarkable journey, if you believe stories of justice and human dignity need to be told, if you believe history's most important battles must be remembered, help us share this story by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. Every subscription helps us bring these vital histories to light. Now, let's begin. The story begins not on a ship, but in West Africa, in the village of Mani in what is now Sierra Leone. The year is 1839. Sengbe Pai is a rice farmer in his mid-20s, a member of the Mende people. He has a wife, he has children, he has a life that is his own, a community that is his home, a future that belongs to him. And then, in an instant, it is all taken away. Sengbe is captured by African slave raiders working for European and American traders. The details of his capture are lost to history, but the pattern is well documented. African kingdoms and raiders, incentivized by European demand for slaves and paid in goods and weapons, conducted raids on neighboring peoples, capturing men, women, and children to sell to slave traders on the coast. Sengbe is marched to the coast, along with hundreds of others. They are held in slave factories, fortified compounds where captured Africans are imprisoned until slave ships arrive to transport them across the Atlantic. The conditions in these factories are horrific. People are chained, beaten, starved. Many die before they ever see a ship. When a ship arrives, a Portuguese slave vessel, Sengbe and approximately 500 other captives are loaded aboard. They are branded with hot irons marking them as property. They are packed into the hold of the ship so tightly that they cannot stand or turn over. The Middle Passage, as this journey is known, is designed to transport the maximum number of Africans while keeping them alive just long enough to sell. The voyage across the Atlantic takes weeks. In the darkness of the hold, people die from disease, from suffocation, from despair. The dead are thrown overboard. The living lie chained next to corpses, unable to move away. Some attempt suicide, choosing death over slavery. The crew prevents this not out of compassion, but because dead Africans cannot be sold. The ship arrives in Havana, Cuba, still a Spanish colony where slavery is legal, and the slave trade, though officially illegal under international treaties, continues with the full knowledge and participation of Spanish authorities. By 1839, the international slave trade has been outlawed by Britain, the United States, and other nations, but enforcement is weak, corruption is rampant, and the demand for slaves in the Americas is insatiable.
In Havana, Sengbei and the other survivors are sold at auction. Two Spanish plantation owners, Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes, purchase 53 Africans, including Sengbei. Ruiz and Montes plan to transport their new property to plantations elsewhere in Cuba aboard a coastal schooner. The ship they charter is called La Amistad. It is a small vessel designed for coastal trade, not for transporting large numbers of people. But Ruiz and Montes load the 53 Africans into the hold, along with the ship's crew and cargo. The Amistad set sail from Havana on June 28, 1839, heading east along the Cuban coast. The Africans in the hold are terrified. They do not speak Spanish. They do not know where they are being taken. Rumors spread among them, passed in whispered Mende, that they are being taken somewhere to be killed and eaten. This is not as irrational as it sounds. Stories of cannibalism by white people circulated among enslaved Africans, sometimes encouraged by slave traders to increase fear and compliance. The conditions aboard the Amistad are brutal, even by the standards of slave transport. The Africans are given barely enough food and water to survive. They are kept chained in the hold. The heat is suffocating. Several become ill. Among the captives is Sengbei P, who the Spanish have given the name Joseph Cinque, Cinque being a corruption of Sengbei. He is strong, intelligent, and desperate. He has been stolen from his home, branded like an animal, transported across an ocean, and sold to men who treat him as property. He has watched people die. He has endured unimaginable suffering. And he has decided that he will not accept this fate. On the night of July 1st, 1839, Sengbei manages to pick the lock on his shackles using a loose nail he has found. He frees himself, then moves through the darkness of the hold, freeing the other Africans one by one. They arm themselves with whatever they can find, cane knives used for cutting sugarcane, which are stored on the ship as cargo. Then they attack. The Africans storm onto the deck. The ship's crew is caught completely by surprise. In the violent struggle that follows, the ship's captain, Ramon Ferrer, and the cook are killed. Two crew members escape by jumping overboard and swimming to shore. The two Spanish slave owners, Ruiz and Montes, are captured, but kept alive because the Africans need them to navigate the ship. The Africans have taken control of La Amistad. They are no longer captives. They are free. Or so they believe.
Sengbei, now the de facto leader of the group, orders Ruiz and Montes to sail the ship back to Africa. He and the other Africans want only one thing: to go home, to return to their families, their villages, their lives. But Ruiz and Montes are not willing to lose their valuable property without a fight. They agree to sail east, toward Africa, during the day, when the Africans can see the sun's position. But at night, when the Africans sleep, the two Spaniards secretly change course, sailing north and west toward the United States. This deception continues for nearly 2 months. The ship zigzags across the Atlantic, moving east by day and northwest by night. Supplies run low. Several Africans die from illness and starvation. The ship becomes a floating nightmare, drifting aimlessly, running out of food and water. The Africans try to make landfall several times to get supplies, approaching the coasts of various islands and the North American mainland. At one point, they anchor off the coast of Long Island, New York, and a group goes ashore to try to obtain food and water. Local residents see them and are alarmed by the sight of armed black men. Word spreads that there are dangerous pirates or escaped slaves in the area. On August 26, 1839, the USS Washington, a United States naval vessel, intercepts the Amistad off the coast of Long Island, New York. The ship is boarded by U.S. naval officers who find the Africans in control of the vessel, with Ruiz and Montes held captive. The Africans believe they are being rescued. They are not.
the American naval officers take control of the ship and arrest the Africans. They are charged not with mutiny, which would imply they were part of the crew, but with piracy and murder on the high seas. The United States government, responding to pressure from Spain, treats the Africans not as victims of kidnapping, but as criminals who killed Spanish subjects and stole Spanish property. The Africans are transported to New Haven, Connecticut, and imprisoned to await trial. They do not speak English, they do not understand the charges against them, they have no lawyers, no advocates, no one who can explain what is happening to them. They are alone in a foreign land, facing the possibility of being executed or returned to slavery in Cuba, where they would almost certainly be killed in retaliation for the deaths of the captain and cook. But their story has captured public attention. Newspapers across the United States report on the Amistad affair. Some portray the Africans as dangerous savages who murdered innocent men. Others see them as victims who fought for their freedom. The case becomes a sensation, a national controversy that forces Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about slavery, freedom, and justice. Among those who take up the Africans' cause are abolitionists, people who believe slavery is morally wrong and should be abolished. In 1839, the abolitionist movement in the United States is growing, but is still controversial. Most white Americans, even in the North where slavery has been abolished, are indifferent or hostile to the idea of racial equality. But a committed group of abolitionists sees in the Amistad case an opportunity to strike a blow against slavery. A group of abolitionists in New York and Connecticut formed the Amistad Committee to provide legal defense for the Africans. They hire lawyers, they raise money, they search for someone who can communicate with the Africans to learn their story.
This last task is extraordinarily difficult. The Africans speak Mende, a language virtually unknown in the United States in 1839. After much searching, the abolitionists find a young African man named James Covey, a former slave who was freed by the British Navy and who speaks Mende. Through Covey, the Africans are finally able to tell their story. What emerges is a narrative that changes everything. These are not slaves who rebelled against their legal owners. They are free people who were kidnapped, transported illegally, and sold in violation of international law. The international slave trade, the transporting of slaves from Africa to the Americas, had been outlawed by Spain, Britain, and the United States. The Africans aboard the Amistad were illegally captured and illegally enslaved. If this story of justice and human rights is resonating with you, if you believe these histories must be preserved and shared, help us by subscribing to our channel. Hit that subscribe button and bell icon so you never miss stories that matter. Your support keeps these essential truths alive. This revelation transforms the case. The Africans are not criminals. They are victims who exercise their natural right to resist kidnapping and false imprisonment. Under international law and natural law, they have every right to fight for their freedom. But the legal battle is far from over. The Spanish government, pressured by Ruiz and Montes, demands that the United States return the Africans to Cuba to face trial for murder under Spanish law. President Martin Van Buren, facing an election and not wanting to alienate Southern slaveholders, sides with Spain and puts pressure on the courts to rule in favor of returning the Africans. The case becomes a test of American justice. Will the courts uphold the law and recognize the Africans' humanity? Or will they bow to political pressure and diplomatic expediency? The legal proceedings begin in the U.S. District Court in Connecticut in September 1839. The case is complicated by multiple competing claims. The Spanish government wants the Africans returned to Cuba. Ruiz and Montes want their property back. The U.S. Navy officers who captured the ship want salvage rights, and the Africans want their freedom and passage back to Africa. The lead attorney for the Africans is Roger Sherman Baldwin, a Connecticut lawyer and abolitionist. Baldwin argues that the Africans are not slaves, but free people who were kidnapped in violation of international law. Under Spanish law itself, the importation of slaves from Africa has been illegal since 1820.
The papers that Rees and Montes presented, claiming the Africans were legally purchased Cuban-born slaves, are fraudulent. The case hinges on establishing the Africans' identity and origin. If they can prove they were born in Africa and brought to Cuba illegally, then they are not legal slaves under any law, Spanish, American, or international. Through James Covey, the interpreter, the Africans testify. Sengbe takes the stand. Through Covey's translation, he tells his story. He describes his village in Africa. He describes his capture. He describes the horrors of the Middle Passage. He describes the conditions aboard the Amistad, and he describes the night they rose up to fight for their freedom. His testimony is powerful and compelling. This is not a rebellious slave. This is a free man who was kidnapped and who fought to return home. The prosecution, representing Spanish interests and supported by the Van Buren administration, argues that the Africans are property under Spanish law, that the papers presented by Rees and Montes are valid, and that the United States is obligated under treaty to return Spanish property.
But Baldwin presents evidence that the papers are fraudulent. He shows that the Africans could not possibly be Cuban-born slaves as the documents claim. They speak no Spanish, they know African languages, they can describe African villages and customs in detail. Expert testimony from linguists and African scholars confirms their African origin. In January 1840, Judge Andrew Judson, a conservative judge who has previously ruled against abolitionists, delivers his verdict. To the surprise of many, he rules in favor of the Africans. He finds that they were illegally kidnapped from Africa, that they were illegally enslaved, and that they had every right to fight for their freedom. He orders that they be freed and provided passage back to Africa. The courtroom erupts in celebration. The Africans, who have been following the proceedings without understanding most of the legal arguments, grasp that they have won. They weep with joy and relief. But the victory is short-lived. The Van Buren administration, under pressure from Spain and from Southern slaveholders who fear the precedent this case might set, appeals the decision. The case moves to the U.S. Circuit Court, which upholds the district court's decision. The government appeals again, taking the case to the United States Supreme Court. The Amistad case will now be decided by the highest court in the land, and the stakes could not be higher. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Africans, it will affirm that illegally enslaved people have the right to fight for their freedom. If it rules against them, it will set a precedent that political expediency and international diplomacy can override fundamental human rights. The abolitionists realize they need someone exceptional to argue the case before the Supreme Court. They approach former President John Quincy Adams. Adams is 73 years old, long retired from the presidency, but serving as a congressman from Massachusetts. He's known as a fierce opponent of slavery and a brilliant legal mind. He is also one of the most respected figures in American public life. His involvement in the case would give it gravitas and public attention. At first, Adams declines. He has not argued a case before the Supreme Court in decades. He doubts his abilities. But the abolitionists persist, and eventually Adams agrees. He will represent the Africans before the Supreme Court. On February 22, 1841, John Quincy Adams rises to address the United States Supreme Court in the case of United States v. the Amistad. He is old, his voice sometimes shakes, but his mind is sharp and his passion is undeniable. Adams speaks for 8.5 hours over 2 days. His argument is not just a legal brief, but a moral indictment of slavery and a defense of natural law and human rights. He begins by attacking the Van Buren administration's conduct in the case. He accuses the government of bowing to Spanish pressure and trampling on the rights of the Africans to appease a foreign power and protect the institution of slavery. He argues that the executive branch has no right to interfere with the judiciary and that the courts must be free to render justice without political pressure. Then Adams turns to the fundamental question at the heart of the case. Are the Africans human beings with natural rights, or are they property? He points to the Declaration of Independence hanging on the wall of the Supreme Court chamber, which proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He asks whether these words mean anything, or whether they apply only to some people and not others.
Adams argues that the Africans were kidnapped in violation of international law, that they were never legally enslaved under any law, and that they had every natural and legal right to resist their captors and fight for their freedom. The killing of the ship's captain and cook, while tragic, was justified self-defense by people resisting illegal kidnapping and imprisonment. He addresses each of the government's arguments systematically, dismantling them with logic and precedent. He cites international treaties, Spanish law, American law, and natural law. He argues that under Spanish law itself, the slave trade from Africa was illegal, and therefore the Africans could not be legal slaves. He points out the absurdity of the government's position. The administration is arguing that the courts should return free people to certain death in Cuba to satisfy diplomatic relations with Spain. He asks whether American justice is for sale, whether human rights can be sacrificed for political convenience. The Supreme Court justices listen intently. 5 of the 9 justices are Southerners and slaveholders. The case is far from a certain victory. But Adams' argument is powerful. He speaks not just to legal precedent, but to conscience. He challenges the justices to uphold the principles upon which the nation was founded, to affirm that justice is not dependent on nationality or race, and to recognize the Africans' fundamental humanity. On March 9, 1841, the Supreme Court delivers its decision. By a vote of 7-1, with 1 justice absent, the court affirms the lower court's decisions. Justice Joseph Story writes the majority opinion. The court holds that the Africans were illegally kidnapped from Africa and illegally enslaved. They were never legal slaves under Spanish law or any other law. They had every right to fight for their freedom. The papers presented by Ruiz and Montes were fraudulent. The Africans are free and must be allowed to return to Africa. It is a stunning victory. The highest court in the United States has recognized the Africans' humanity and their right to freedom. It has rejected the arguments of the executive branch and affirmed the independence of the judiciary. The Africans, who have been imprisoned in Connecticut for more than a year and a half, are finally free. The legal battle is won, but the practical challenges remain. The Africans are free, but they are stranded thousands of miles from home with no means of getting back to Africa. The abolitionists who have supported them raise money for their return voyage. This takes time. Months pass as funds are collected and arrangements are made. During this time, the Africans remain in Connecticut. They are taught English. They are taught about Christianity. Some convert, though whether this is genuine conviction or a pragmatic decision influenced by their dependence on Christian abolitionists is debatable. They become something of a public spectacle, with people paying to see them and hear them speak. Singbe, in particular, becomes a celebrity of sorts. He is articulate, charismatic, and becomes the face of the Amistad case. He travels and speaks, raising awareness and money, but he never loses sight of his goal, to return home. Finally, in November 1841, arrangements are complete. A group of 35 Africans, along with several American missionaries, board a ship bound for Sierra Leone. Not all of the original 53 make the journey. Several have died during their imprisonment, and a few choose to remain in the United States. The return voyage takes several weeks. When they arrive in Sierra Leone in January 1942, nearly 3 years after their original capture, the surviving Africans finally set foot on African soil again. They are home.
But home has changed. Some find that their families have moved or died. Some find that the villages they left are no longer the same. The trauma of their experience, the kidnapping, the Middle Passage, the months of imprisonment, the trial, has changed them irrevocably. Sengbe attempts to return to his village in Mani. He finds that his wife has remarried, believing him dead, and that his children do not remember him. The homecoming he dreamed of during his months of captivity is bittersweet at best. He stays in Sierra Leone, eventually working with the American missionaries who had accompanied the Africans back. He becomes a translator and a Christian preacher. But he is also caught between worlds, no longer fully part of his original community, but never fully integrated into the Western missionary world either. He dies in Sierra Leone sometime in the 1870s, the exact date unknown. His story, which had captivated the world, fades from public memory for more than a century. The Amistad case did not end slavery. It did not prevent the Civil War. It did not solve the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American Republic, the coexistence of slavery with a founding commitment to liberty and equality. But it mattered. The case established important legal precedents. The Supreme Court affirmed that illegally enslaved people have the right to fight for their freedom. It recognized that international treaties prohibiting the slave trade have legal force, and that fraudulent documents cannot be used to enslave free people. It demonstrated that the judiciary can act independently of the executive branch, even on politically sensitive issues. More importantly, the Amistad case became a rallying point for the abolitionist movement. It showed that slavery could be challenged in court. It demonstrated that when presented with evidence and moral arguments, even conservative judges could rule in favor of freedom. It gave hope to abolitionists and worried slaveholders, who saw the case as a dangerous precedent. The case also exposed the international nature of the slave trade and the complicity of supposedly civilized nations in its continuation. Although the international slave trade had been officially outlawed by most European powers and the United States by 1839, it continued with widespread corruption and minimal enforcement. The Amistad case brought this hypocrisy into public view. For the Africans themselves, the case meant freedom, a freedom that was fought for and won in the courts, not given as a gift. They proved that they were not property, but human beings with rights. They forced America to confront the reality of the slave trade. They demonstrated courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Sengbe Pa, Joseph Sinke, became a symbol of resistance and the fight for freedom. His story, and the story of the other Africans aboard La Amistad, inspired later generations of activists and freedom fighters. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, the Amistad case was remembered as an early example of African Americans fighting for their rights through the legal system. In 1997, director Steven Spielberg brought the story to a mainstream audience with the film Amistad, starring Jimon Hunsu as Sinke and Anthony Hopkins as John Quincy Adams. The film, while taking some dramatic liberties, introduced millions of people to a story that had been largely forgotten. Today, the Amistad case is taught in schools and law schools as a landmark in American jurisprudence and human rights law. The Amistad Research Center at Tulane University preserves documents and artifacts related to the case. A replica of the ship La Amistad serves as a floating museum and educational platform, sailing along the East Coast and teaching about the history of the slave trade and the fight for freedom. If this story of courage and justice has moved you, if you believe these histories must be preserved and shared with future generations, help us by subscribing to our channel. Click that subscribe button and notification bell to ensure you never miss these essential stories. Your support keeps history alive. The story of La Amistad forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. Questions about human rights, about the rule of law, about the courage required to fight for justice when the system is stacked against you. The Africans aboard the Amistad had every reason to despair.
They were kidnapped from their homes, transported across an ocean in unimaginable conditions, sold as property, and imprisoned in a foreign land where they could not speak the language and had no understanding of the legal system. They faced execution or returned to slavery in Cuba, where death was almost certain. But they did not give up. Sengbe Pie, Joseph Chinke, a rice farmer from a small village in West Africa, stood before the highest court in one of the most powerful nations on earth and demanded his freedom. And he won. His victory was not just personal, it was a victory for the principle that all human beings have inherent rights that cannot be taken away by force or fraud. It was an affirmation that the law, when properly applied, can be an instrument of justice rather than oppression. The Amistad case also reminds us of the importance of advocates, the abolitionists who took up the Africans' cause when no one else would, the lawyers who fought for years without payment, the former president who came out of retirement to argue for strangers' freedom, the interpreter who made communication possible. Justice did not happen automatically. It required people willing to fight for it. And the case reminds us that progress is never inevitable. The Supreme Court could have ruled differently. The Africans could have been returned to Cuba and executed. History is not predetermined. It is shaped by the choices people make, by their courage or cowardice, by their willingness to fight for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The story of La Amistad is fundamentally a story about the value we place on human life and human freedom. It asks us whether we believe that all people are created equal, or whether some people's lives matter more than others. It asks whether we are willing to stand up for justice even when it is inconvenient, politically risky, or difficult. These questions did not end with the Amistad case. They did not end with the abolition of slavery. They remain urgent and relevant today, wherever people are denied their rights, wherever freedom is under threat, wherever human beings are treated as less than fully human. Sengbe Pie, Joseph Chinke, a rice farmer from a small village in West Africa, stood before the most powerful court in one of the most powerful nations on earth and demanded his freedom. And he won.
His story reminds us that ordinary people, given courage and opportunity, can change history. That one person's refusal to accept injustice can spark a movement. That the arc of history, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would later say, bends toward justice, but only when people are willing to bend it. The Africans of La Amistad bent the arc. They broke their chains. They fought for their freedom. They stood trial and won. They went home. Their story is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit, to the power of resistance, and to the possibility of justice. It is a story that deserves to be remembered and retold, generation after generation, so that we never forget what they fought for and what they won. Freedom is never free. It must be fought for, defended, and won again in every generation. The Africans of La Amistad understood this. They paid the price. They won the victory, and their legacy endures. La Amistad, the ship of friendship, the ship of suffering, the ship that carried 53 Africans from slavery to freedom, from captivity to victory, from silence to a voice that echoes across history. Never forgotten, always remembered, forever free.